John had always loved the feeling of the open road. His motorcycle was more than just a machine. It was freedom, a small rebellion against the monotony of suburban life. After a long day at work, he often took his bike out for a spin, the wind cutting through the evening air, clearing his mind. Then, like clockwork, he'd return home, park the bike neatly in his driveway, and settle into the quiet comfort of his house. That Wednesday evening had been no different. The sun was dipping low, casting golden streaks across the manicured lawns and tidy houses of Crestwood Estates, the neighborhood where John had lived for nearly a decade. He pulled his motorcycle into the driveway, the familiar scrape of tires on concrete sounding like a welcome home. He didn't think twice about it. The next morning, as John stepped outside to get the morning paper, a folded envelope caught his eye, wedged under the windshield wiper of his motorcycle. It was marked with the Crestwood Estates HOA logo, crisp and official. John's pulse quickened. HOA notices were usually routine reminders about trash days or landscaping. This, however, looked different. He unfolded the letter carefully, scanning the words. "Dear Mr. Miller, it has come to the attention of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association Board that you are in violation of community parking regulations by storing a motorcycle in your driveway. As per Section 4.2.1 of the HOA Covenants and Restrictions, vehicles of this nature must be kept in enclosed garages or designated areas away from public view. Please remove your motorcycle from your driveway within 7 days to avoid further action." John blinked, rereading the letter in disbelief. Motorcycle parking? That was it? He'd lived here 10 years, and never once had this been an issue. Neighbors often parked RVs or boats on their driveways with no notice. Was the HOA really cracking down on a single motorcycle? A creeping sense of unease settled over him. John pulled out his copy of the HOA rules, flipping through the pages. Section 4.2.1 was there, but vague. Vehicles must be parked in garages or approved parking areas. No specific mention of motorcycles. The language felt like a catch-all designed to intimidate rather than clarify. He decided to call the HOA office. The receptionist was polite but unhelpful, directing him to the board's email address for further inquiries. He wrote a respectful message asking for clarification, hoping this was a misunderstanding. Days passed with no response. The letters. Deadline loomed, and John found himself pacing in his kitchen, the motorcycle parked just a few feet away. What if he didn't comply? What consequences awaited him? He knew many homeowners dreaded HOA conflicts, whispered stories of fines piling up, endless letters, neighbors turning cold. His phone buzzed one afternoon with a message from a neighbor, Karen, who'd lived 2 houses down for 15 years. "Did you get that letter? Crazy, right? Heard they're starting to crack down hard." John thanked her, but felt the chill of isolation. Was this going to escalate? The evening before the deadline, John sat on his porch, staring at his motorcycle under the soft glow of the street lamp. It was just a bike, a part of his life. Yet now, it felt like a symbol of something much bigger, control, conflict, and an invisible war simmering beneath the tidy streets. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, his mind raced. This wasn't just about parking anymore. It was personal. John couldn't shake the feeling that this quiet suburban community, which once felt like home, was quietly turning against him. And the worst was yet to come. The morning after the letter's deadline passed, John braced himself. He half expected a polite note thanking him for compliance, or at least a chance to discuss the matter. Instead, his mailbox held something far more menacing. A second letter from the HOA, this one thicker and stamped with urgent red ink. Notice of violation and fine assessment. John's hands trembled as he tore it open. The letter stated that because his motorcycle remained parked in his driveway beyond the deadline, he was being fined $500 per day, retroactive to the day after the original letter. The total was already mounting dangerously close to $3,500, and worse, the fines would keep accumulating unless he removed the bike. His stomach twisted. This wasn't a simple request anymore. It was a siege. Desperate, John dialed the HOA board's contact number again, hoping to speak directly to someone, the chairperson, a manager, anyone, but after several calls, he was either put on hold endlessly or transferred to voicemail boxes that were never answered. His emails requesting a meeting were met with silence. John soon realized he was facing a wall, cold, unyielding, and opaque. Meanwhile, whispers began to stir in the neighborhood. The community that once nodded politely in passing now regarded John with sideways glances. At the local grocery store, a few neighbors subtly avoided eye contact. At a weekend barbecue a couple of streets over, John overheard someone muttering about rule breakers and setting a bad example. He felt the weight of isolation closing in. One evening, as John walked his dog past the community park, he noticed a group of neighbors clustered near the gazebo. They glanced his way and fell silent. His heart pounded with anxiety. Was the HOA rallying residents against him? Was this a personal crusade? John's best friend Mark tried to reassure him over coffee. Look, maybe the HOA's just overreacting. It's not worth losing sleep over. Just park the bike in the garage for now and keep your head down. But John couldn't. The garage was cluttered with boxes and tools. The motorcycle didn't fit easily. Besides, the whole point was that the rules felt unfair. Like a power play, the tension built day by day. Notices piled up with increasingly harsh language. Threats of legal action, warnings of liens against his property, and even hints at suspension of community privileges. John's mailbox felt like a ticking time bomb. He started documenting everything. Copies of letters, photographs of the motorcycle exactly where it had always been, notes of phone calls and ignored messages. He reached out to online forums for advice from other homeowners who'd tangled with overzealous HOAs. In the shadows, John sensed something else was unfolding. The HOA board meetings, once open and routine, had become secretive affairs held behind closed doors. When John tried to attend, he was turned away with vague explanations of special executive sessions. The rules were shifting, and no one would say why. One night, a strange incident shook him to his core. Returning home late, John found his mailbox pried open and scattered mail across the lawn. A neighbor's security camera footage, obtained, later through a friend, showed two hooded figures rifling through his property in the dead of night. No one claimed responsibility. No one was caught. John's fear deepened. This was no longer just a parking dispute. It felt like a calculated campaign to intimidate and isolate him. But why? What had he done to become the target of such relentless hostility? He hadn't broken any laws, hadn't harmed anyone. He just wanted to park his motorcycle where it had always been. The unanswered questions gnawed at him, fueling a rising storm of anxiety. With each passing day, the pressure mounted, threatening not just his finances, but his sense of safety and belonging. John realized he was at a crossroads. Comply and lose his freedom to enjoy his hobby, or fight back against a faceless authority that seemed intent on crushing him. He chose the fight. But little did he know, the battle was only just beginning, and the stakes would soon explode far beyond a mere motorcycle in a driveway. John sat at his kitchen table, a strong cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the stack of HOA letters that now dominated the counter like a growing storm. For the first time in weeks, silence hung over the house. No phone ringing, no emails chirping, just the thrum of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then came the knock, not a casual tap, a heavy, deliberate knock. 3 sharp raps that made his stomach twist. He opened the door to a man in a gray suit, carrying a briefcase and an envelope. His expression was polite, almost rehearsed. "Mr. Miller?" he asked. John nodded. "You've been served," the man said, placing the envelope in John's hand before turning and walking away without another word. John stared after him, stunned. He closed the door, tore open the envelope, and sat down slowly as he read the first lines of the legal document. Notice of civil complaint. The Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association vs. John Miller. Claim amount, $270,000. His vision. Blurred. $270,000. John flipped through the pages in disbelief. The HOA was suing him for willful and repeated violations of community guidelines, claiming irreparable damage to neighborhood aesthetics, reduced property values, and obstruction of community harmony. They were demanding damages, legal fees, and back-assessed fines, all stemming from the continued presence of his motorcycle in the driveway. It didn't feel real. Not even in a worst-case scenario had he imagined something this extreme. He grabbed his phone, hands shaking, and called Mark. "They're suing me," John said, his voice barely a whisper, "for $250,000 over a parking space." Mark was speechless. "That's insane. You need a lawyer, fast." John spent the next few hours on the phone with every property attorney he could find. Most were booked solid or reluctant to take on an HOA case. They were complex, and many attorneys disliked going up against powerful associations entrenched in local government and backed by well-funded legal teams. Finally, a firm agreed to consult. The lawyer, a sharp and seasoned woman named Rachel Voss, sat across from him the following afternoon, flipping through the lawsuit with a mix of concern and disbelief. "This is outrageous," she muttered. "But not uncommon," she explained. How HOAs often used aggressive tactics to enforce their codes, and how some relied on escalating fines and lawsuits to scare homeowners into submission. Most people backed down early. John hadn't, and now he was being made an example. "This isn't just about the motorcycle," Rachel said. "They're trying to bury you." John clenched his jaw. "I'm not backing down, not over something this ridiculous." But he knew what he was up against. The HOA had resources, legal firepower, and, most chilling of all, the ability to impact his home, his credit, his future. Still, something didn't sit right. Why go this far over a motorcycle? Why target him and not the others? He remembered the RV 2 doors down, the jet skis 3 blocks over. He made a list, photos, addresses, evidence of unequal enforcement. The fight had changed. This wasn't just about his motorcycle anymore. That night, as John stood by his window, staring at the empty driveway, he felt the pressure closing in like a vice. They wanted to break him, but he wasn't broken yet. He turned back inside, pulled out a notebook, and started writing. Names, dates, photos, everything. If the HOA wanted a war, they were about to get one, and John was going to make damn sure. They regretted picking the wrong homeowner. The days after the lawsuit were a blur. John moved like a man walking through fog, purposeful but uncertain. His routine was shattered. Every morning he checked the driveway like a man inspecting a crime scene. The motorcycle remained parked exactly where it had always been, but now it felt radioactive, as if just owning it made him a threat. But something had changed in John. The lawsuit didn't break him. It activated him, armed with Rachel Voss as his legal counsel and a growing collection of HOA violations. John turned to the only thing he could trust: facts. He began walking the neighborhood with quiet purpose, snapping discreet photos of other violations. Boats parked halfway on lawns. Oversized trucks too wide for garage clearance. Trash bins left out for days. Decorative fountains in violation of landscaping rules. And yet, no lawsuits, no letters, no $270,000 threats. It wasn't enforcement. It was selective punishment. One evening, while photographing a neighbor's double-wide camper nestled in their driveway, John heard a soft voice behind him. "You're not crazy, you know." He turned. It was Karen, the same neighbor who had texted him weeks ago about the initial letter. She stood with her arms crossed, looking both cautious and fed up. "They came after me last year over flower boxes," she said. "Claimed they didn't match the exterior color scheme. Said I had 7 days to remove them or face daily fines." John stared. "That's ridiculous." Karen nodded. "That's what I thought too, until I went to a board meeting and watched them laugh when I brought it up, like it was some inside joke." John lowered his voice. "Did you ever hear of them going after anyone else like this?" She hesitated. "Only the ones who push back. There was a guy, Richard Downs, tried to run for a seat on the board. Next thing you know, they were fining him for noise complaints because his grandson played piano." John scribbled the name down. "Where's Richard now?" "Moved out. Sold his place at a loss just to get away from them." The whole thing broke him. That night, John did a deep dive on the current HOA board members. 4 names. All had been on the board for at least 6 years. All lived on the same side of the community, the preferred section, where the rules seemed to apply a little more loosely. One name stuck out in particular: Paul Lanning, the HOA president. Paul owned a real estate consulting firm, Public. Records showed he'd helped broker at least 3 home sales in Crestwood Estates in the past 2 years, each from homeowners who had left after unresolved disputes with the HOA. It wasn't enforcement. It was profit. Push out a resident with nuisance fines, force them to sell low, snap up the property or broker the deal, make money, start over. It was a system, and John was the latest target. Fueled by a blend of anger and clarity, he started reaching out. Quiet phone calls, anonymous emails. Neighbors who once stayed silent began to open up, stories of threats, harassment, and legal bullying. But not all responses were friendly. Late one night, John found a note taped to his front door. Sloppy handwriting, red ink, no signature. Back, off, or it gets worse. The next morning, a screw was lodged in his motorcycle tire. Not an accident. John brought the note and a photo of the damaged tire to Rachel, who frowned as she read. "This isn't just legal anymore," she said. "It's personal. And they're playing dirty." John nodded. "Then it's time I played smart." Because the web of secrets was unraveling, and what waited at its center was darker than he ever imagined. The tension in Crestwood Estates had become thick enough to choke on. What was once a quiet, manicured community now hummed with suspicion and whispered warnings. Curtains twitched when John walked by. Conversations stopped when he entered the grocery store. And through it all, the HOA remained a faceless enforcer, lurking behind formal letters and silent board meetings. John was living in a powder keg, and he was about to light the fuse. Rachel, his attorney, had been digging. She'd filed subpoenas for HOA records and communications. It was a long shot, but if they could prove the board was weaponizing fines to push homeowners out for profit, it could change everything. Unfortunately, the HOA's legal team was stalling. Objections, delays, redacted documents. They were fighting like people with something to hide. "This lawsuit isn't just about the bike," Rachel said one morning in her office. "It's about precedent. They think if they crush you, no one else will dare resist." John nodded grimly. "Then let's give them a reason to be afraid." That night, John did something bold and dangerous. He stood in his driveway, set up a tripod, and recorded a video. He introduced himself, laid out his story, the motorcycle, the fines, the absurd lawsuit. He showed proof of selective enforcement, dozens of photos of similar violations, ignored by the board. He explained how the HOA's president had financial ties to forced sales, and finally, he displayed the threat note and the sabotage tire. He didn't name names, not yet. But the implications were crystal clear. Then, he uploaded it. The video exploded. Within 48 hours, it had over 75,000 views on YouTube and was spreading across Facebook groups, HOA, horror story forums, and even local news pages. Messages poured in, support, outrage, and chillingly similar stories from people across the country. Even some of John's own neighbors began to reach out anonymously. One message stood out. "Meet me behind the clubhouse, 10 p.m. Wednesday. Come alone. I have something you'll want." John stared at the message, unsure if it was a trap. But curiosity won. He arrived early, parking 2 streets over and approaching on foot. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The street lamps around the clubhouse flickered faintly, casting long shadows. A figure stepped out from behind the building, a woman in her 50s holding a manila envelope. "You don't know me," she said, "but I used to be on the HOA board. I quit 2 years ago." "Why?" John asked. She handed him the envelope. "Because I found out what Paul was doing, and when I tried to call him out, I got hit with a lawsuit for breach of confidentiality. I lost everything fighting it." John opened the envelope. Inside were copies of emails, meeting transcripts, and internal memos, documents that showed the board had deliberately targeted specific homeowners based on property value and resale opportunity. He felt sick. "This is it," he said. "This proves everything." "Be careful," she warned. "They'll come after you hard now." As John walked back into the darkness, clutching the evidence, he knew she was right. He'd just escalated the war, from legal to personal, from conflict to expose. Back home, he scanned every page and sent it straight to Rachel. "This is the crack in the dam," she said the next morning. "Now we push." But even as they prepared their countersuit, something gnawed at John. If Paul and the board were willing to threaten, sabotage, and financially ruin homeowners, what else were they willing to do to keep their grip on power? The storm wasn't coming. It had already begun. John knew they wouldn't take it lying down, not after the video, not after the documents, and especially not with Rachel preparing to file a countersuit that accused the HOA of fraud, discrimination, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Still, he didn't expect it to come so fast. 2 days after the video went viral, John woke up to pounding fists on his front door. He opened it to find 2 county code enforcement officers, flanked by a man in a navy blue suit who introduced himself as an HOA compliance consultant. "We've received a complaint regarding multiple violations on your property," the consultant said smoothly. "Overgrown landscaping, non-conforming exterior paint, and possible unauthorized modifications to the driveway." John blinked. "You're kidding me, right?" The officers weren't. One of them pulled out a clipboard. "We're here to document everything. If the violations are confirmed, you'll receive a formal citation and possible county fines." John followed them outside, jaw tight. His grass was perfectly trimmed. The paint on his siding hadn't changed in 5 years. The modification to the driveway, a crack that had been there since he moved in. "This is harassment," he said, thinly veiled and pathetic. The consultant smiled without warmth. "Just doing our job." By noon, his mailbox contained another HOA letter. This one claimed he was in violation of community decorum standards due to the publication of defamatory content and incitement of hostility toward board members. They were threatening an additional $50,000 in damages. They were spinning the narrative. John, once a quiet homeowner, had now been labeled an agitator, a threat to community order. Some residents rallied behind him, emboldened by his courage. But others, fearful of being caught in the crossfire, began to back away. The isolation grew again, only this time sharper, more personal. Then came the break-in. It happened at 2:14 a.m. The motion sensor light flared on, waking John. He grabbed his phone and quietly crept to the front window. A dark figure was crouched near the base of his porch, reaching into his electrical panel. John snapped a photo through the glass just before the figure bolted into the shadows. The next morning, his security cameras were dead, his garage keypad was fried, and his breaker box had been tampered with. When the police arrived, John gave them the photo, the note from weeks ago, and a full report. But with no clear suspect and no physical damage to the home, they couldn't do much. Could be random, the officer said, though he didn't sound convinced. Rachel was furious. "They're escalating," she said. "You're too public now for them to do anything overt, but they're going to keep trying to make your life unlivable. We need to move fast with the countersuit." She filed the paperwork within 48 hours, naming not just the HOA, but each board member individually, including Paul Lanning. She also included documentation from the whistleblower and evidence of illegal financial conflicts of interest. The legal gears began to turn. Then came the twist. A package arrived at John's door, no return address. Inside was a single USB drive. No note. Just a sticky tab with one word. "Listen." John plugged it into an old laptop, air-gapped from his home network. On it were audio recordings, dozens. One stood out immediately. It was Paul's voice. "Just make it unbearable for him. Fine him into the ground. He'll fold or sell just like the others." John sat frozen, the room spinning. This wasn't just civil misconduct, it was conspiracy. Now he had proof of intent, of malice, and maybe criminal activity. As Rachel listened in stunned silence, she said, "John, this changes everything. This isn't just a case anymore. This could be a takedown." But with that proof came risk, because now the people trying to ruin him had everything to lose, and desperate people are dangerous. The USB drive was a bomb, and John was about to detonate it. The audio of Paul Lanning's voice plotting to financially destroy him wasn't just damning, it was dynamite. With it, the lawsuit flipped from a desperate defense into a powerful offense. Rachel wasted no time. She filed a motion to compel the HOA to produce full, unredacted records and submitted the audio as supporting evidence. But John wasn't content keeping it behind courtroom walls. He uploaded a second video. This time there was no restraint. He laid out everything, the fines, the lawsuits, the sabotage, the intimidation. Then he played the recording. Paul's voice echoed across the internet. "Just make it unbearable for him. Fine him into the ground. He'll fold or sell just like the others." The video exploded faster than the first. Local media picked it up. A news van parked on John Street the next morning. Then another. Headlines flashed across TV screens and social feeds. HOA corruption exposed. Homeowner fights $270K. Fine with shocking audio. Journalists started knocking. Neighbors who had once whispered behind curtains began speaking on record. Karen gave an interview naming specific harassment tactics. So did others, people who had stayed silent out of fear, now emboldened by the storm John had summoned. The HOA board tried to go quiet, canceling meetings and locking down their social media accounts. But it was too late. Public outrage swelled. Petitions circulated to dissolve the Crestwood HOA entirely. Dozens of residents signed an emergency motion to remove the entire board. A local politician even weighed in, promising a formal investigation into HOA oversight abuse in the county. But John wasn't done. Rachel scheduled a press conference outside the county courthouse. John stood beside her, tired but resolute, as cameras flashed. "This is not just about me," John said into the mic. "It's about power being abused, communities being manipulated, and silence being used as a weapon. I parked a motorcycle in my own driveway, and that nearly cost me everything." He paused. "But now it's going to cost them." The next day, Rachel filed a formal request for criminal investigation into the HOA board's financial dealings, especially Paul Lanning's connections to local property investors. Then the first domino fell. One of the board members, Ann Whitaker, resigned suddenly, citing personal reasons. But what caught Rachel's attention was that her attorney quietly reached out to offer cooperation. Anne had been recording meetings too, and she had even more audio, conversations that detailed how the board deliberately selected homes to target, often based on whether they were near Paul's future sale prospects. She even had a spreadsheet. With her testimony and the evidence mounting, the case turned nuclear. John received a call late one evening from a reporter who had spoken with Anne directly. "You don't know this," the reporter said, "but there's a reason they chose you." "What do you mean?" John asked, heart pounding. "Your property is adjacent to a parcel Paul's firm had been eyeing for redevelopment." "Your motorcycle?" "It wasn't about that. You were just in the way." John sat in stunned silence. They never wanted him to comply. They wanted him gone, and now their game was exposed to the world. The lawsuit, once a noose tightening around John's neck, had transformed into a legal sledgehammer aimed at the heart of a corrupt institution. But with everything coming to light, one question still lingered like smoke after a fire. What would Paul do now, cornered, exposed, and with everything on the line? Because the board may have been cracking, but the kingpin hadn't played his last move yet. The courtroom was packed. Media crews lined the hallway, microphones poised like weapons. Local news had turned the case into headline gold. The man who faced a $270,000 lawsuit for parking a motorcycle and exposed an empire of HOA corruption in the process. John sat at the plaintiff's table with Rachel, calm but burning with anticipation. Across the aisle sat Paul Lanning, ashen-faced, arms crossed, defiant to the bitter end. The judge entered. Silence fell. "This court has reviewed evidence submitted by both parties," the judge began, voice steady, "including recorded conversations, whistleblower testimony, and financial documents obtained during discovery." She looked directly at Paul. "What we have here is not just abuse of authority. It is systemic exploitation. This was not enforcement. It was manipulation for financial gain." A collective breath filled the room. John felt Rachel sit taller beside him. "I hereby dismiss the HOA's lawsuit against Mr. Reynolds as without merit, and award damages in his favor in the amount of $500,000 for emotional distress, legal, costs and loss of property value incurred due to HOA harassment." A murmur rippled through the gallery, but the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I am referring Mr. Lanning and the remaining board members for criminal investigation under state racketeering and real estate fraud statutes." Paul's head snapped toward the judge, his face contorting in disbelief. It was over. Outside the courthouse, John stood before the cameras, tired but triumphant. "I never wanted a fight," he said. "I wanted peace in my own driveway. But when someone tries to crush you over something that petty, there's usually a bigger reason. We found it, and we stopped it." The press cheered. Supporters clapped. Even neighbors who once turned away now stood behind him. Over the following weeks, the fallout was swift. Paul Lanning was arrested after forensic accountants discovered he'd funneled kickbacks from shady sales into offshore accounts. The Crestwood Estates HOA was dissolved by majority vote, residents now managing their own neighborhood via a newly elected community council. Other HOAs across the state came under scrutiny, leading to a push for legal reform and mandatory transparency laws. Rachel was invited to speak on national news outlets about the case. Her name, now known far beyond the county, and John kept his motorcycle parked right where it always had been, in the driveway, gleaming like a trophy in the sun. He thought that was the end of the story. But then, the letter came. No return address, no postage, hand-delivered. Inside, a single page, typed, "Congratulations, you beat Paul, but don't think for a second he was the top of the food chain. Crestwood was one of many communities. And Paul, just a small-time operator, a middleman. What you stumbled into wasn't corruption, it was a network." John stared at the page, skin crawling. Beneath the message, A list of 3 more HOA board names from 3 different cities, each with a red check mark next to them. Was this someone warning him or inviting him? His phone buzzed. A message from Rachel. "You okay? Got time to talk?" John looked back at the letter and smiled faintly. He wasn't just a homeowner anymore. He was a spark. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning, the end.